We've looked at what makes a good argument, both deductive and inductive. Let's look at where arguments break down. And we're going to look at fallacies. Now, fallacies, I think, this is where philosophy and logic gets kind of interesting or fun, actually, because you find fallacies all over, logical fallacies. Whether you're looking at internet com boxes where people are leaving comments, or Facebook debates, or those arguments you have at Thanksgiving with your relatives, or commercials. A whole course could be taught on fallacies by using commercials. Because if you think about it, every commercial wants you to come to the conclusion that you need to buy X, when in fact you probably don't need to buy X. And so for that commercial to try to convince you, to argue for you that you need to buy X, it probably has a fallacy in it somewhere. So we can watch out for fallacies in commercials, in debates, political argumentation, all that kind of stuff. So what is a fallacy? A fallacy is simply a failure, intentional or unintentional, of the proposed premises of a would-be deductive or inductive argument to actually support the stated conclusion. This is a failure distinct from premises being false, right? So we're not talking about, you know, when I said all cats are alligators. Well, that's clearly false. We're talking about something else. There's something about the form of the argument, or something going on in the argument, that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. That's distinct from the premises actually being false. Let's look at some of these fallacies. You know, if only all people argued like this, where they civilly pointed out logical fallacies rather than name-calling and this kind of thing, the world would be a much better place. On the other hand, I don't suggest constantly pointing out the logical fallacies of your spouse. They stop appreciating that after a while. Let's look at some common fallacies of deduction. Remember, when it comes to deduction, the arguments are pretty clear-cut, right? If the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily must be true. The conclusion necessarily follows. There's only so many things you can do, really, to deconstruct or attack a deductive argument. You could say that a term is poorly defined or vague in the argument. You could say that one of the premises is false, or you could show that it's invalid, that it's the wrong, improper logical form. Those are really the only ways to dismantle or attack a logical deduction. One example of this would be equivocation. This happens rather frequently. This would be the case of, depending on how you look at it, this is either a poorly defined term, we're using a word vaguely or wrongly, or also it really affects also the logical structure. So, for instance, consider the example, the argument, all in labor should join a union. Gloria went into labor this morning. Therefore, Gloria should join a union, right? So let me read that again. All in labor should join a union. Gloria went into labor this morning. Therefore, Gloria should join a union. The problem, of course, is that in labor has two different meanings in the argument. So the term is being used poorly. You could say it's a poorly used vague term, but it also does affect the logical structure. What it ends up doing is introducing a fourth term. These categorical arguments have three terms. Think of all cats are mammals, all tabbies are cats, therefore all tabbies are mammals. Your three terms are cats, tabbies, and mammals. In this example, it introduces a fourth term, right? You have labor, union, and Gloria, except labor has two meanings. You have in labor 1, in labor 2, Gloria, and join a union. So it actually also messes with the logical structure. So equivocation are the words being used consistently in the same way across the argument. Another example of an equivocation in an argument that I love, and I always throw this out to younger students, like high school students, see what they do with it. Nothing is better than God. A peanut butter sandwich is better than nothing. Therefore, a peanut butter sandwich is better than God. That's an equivocation, actually, on the word nothing. Another common one, and we mentioned this with hypothetical arguments, right, is affirming the consequent. This is a fallacy found in conditional or hypothetical arguments where one affirms the then clause of an if-then premise and then concludes that the if clause is true. So, for example, if Aaron got the scholarship, then he will be out celebrating. But Aaron is out celebrating! Therefore, he must have gotten the scholarship, right? However, assuming that both of the premises are true, it doesn't necessarily follow that Aaron got the scholarship, right? If Aaron got the scholarship, he will be out celebrating. Let's say that's true, that if Aaron got the scholarship, he would be out celebrating. And let's assume it's true that Aaron is out celebrating. It doesn't necessarily follow, even if those are both true, that he got the scholarship, because he could be out celebrating because he got a check in the mail from the IRS. I don't know. It could be for a million reasons he's out celebrating, right? So affirming the consequent is a common fallacy of deduction. And under this category would be other fallacies that have to do with improper structure of the argument and invalid argument. Now, the really fun ones, though, come in with induction, because there are just tremendous numbers of common fallacies of induction. We're just going to look at a few in this list, and it's certainly not exhaustive. Much more numerous than fallacies of deduction. So let's look at some fallacies of induction. Hasty generalizations. This is where one infers from several instances of a kind K having property P that all members of kind K have property P. So, for example, I've encountered 3 house cats owned by friends, and all 3 were very unfriendly. Therefore, all house cats are unfriendly. This would be the example I gave in a previous video of, we looked at 2 apples, and they were both bad. Therefore, the whole truck of apples must be bad. Hasty generalization. Missing the point. One draws a different conclusion from the premises than which are actually warranted. So the premises point in one direction and we go another. So for example, no one knows about our food pantry, few patrons are appearing, and I've talked to a number of parishioners who say they had no idea that we even had such a program. Conclusion, clearly we should simply eliminate it and focus parish efforts towards other ministries. See, that doesn't necessarily follow from those premises, right? One could say, maybe we should advertise the food pantry instead. A red herring. A red herring, this is in a situation where a proposal is being debated or a question discussed. One simply changes the topic of debate and offers arguments supporting a different conclusion than the one under discussion. A red herring is a distraction, right? It's something that has no bearing on what we're talking about. It pretends that one has successfully established a position for or against the original issue of the debate based on the distraction. So, as an example of a red herring, how about, regarding the question of dropping the 8:30 Sunday Mass at St. Florian's and allowing our sister parish, St. Philip's, to cover that time slot, I would like to say the following. Both parishes need to cooperate. We need to coordinate the catechetical and youth ministry programs of both parishes to use our limited resources more effectively. It will involve amalgamating the 2 staffs and finding common times and locations for the program. See the little switch there, the distraction, right? We were talking about masses, and now you're talking about cooperating on catechetical programs. False cause. A causally irrelevant state of affairs or event is identified as the determining cause, or a contributing cause. Or, a partial or contributing cause is identified as the entire cause of some or other state of affairs. For example, parents simply not doing their jobs is the reason for the explosion of drug abuse among our youth. Or, Smith Industries moved their plant to Memphis shortly after the current mayor took office. We need to vote her out of office and get city employment back to where it was before her administration. Right? A common variant of this is post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is Latin for after this, therefore because of this. Right? So a lot of times cause and effect happen one after the other. So I slammed the door and the picture fell, therefore The picture fell because the door was slammed. But just because something comes after doesn't mean that it's always caused by the thing before. So false cause. Slippery slope, which is a very common one. Slippery slope says that a single course of action, it's argued, will initiate a causal chain of events ending finally in some very undesirable situation. Therefore, it's concluded the initial course of action in question should be avoided. For example, don't order French fries. You'll start eating fries every time we go out, and you'll become addicted to them, and if you become a French fry addict, you'll develop a taste for all fatty foods, and then come down with heart problems and die. Right? So order the French fries and die. You don't want to die, so don't eat the French fries. Now, it should be noted, right? Sometimes, though, it's very valid that X will produce Y and Y Z, and we don't want Z, so avoid X. So one has to judge these situations, whether or not the slippery slope is a false chain, right? Weak analogy. We saw this with the example I used. I forget the name now, about he dropped out of school, bummed around, but his uncle started a business under the same circumstances, so he will too, right? Weak analogy. So, for example, raising a young child is very similar to training a pet. The parent, like the pet owner, like the owner with her pet, always needs to let the child know who's in charge. Just treat your child like a pet because they're very similar. Well, that's a weak analogy. Begging the question can be a tricky one, but again, very common. This is a broad category of fallacies, including arguments which support a controversial conclusion by relying on a premise that's equally controversial, right? Sometimes arguments for the existence of God get picked on because of this. Picked on is a pejorative term. I shouldn't say that. They're criticized because of this. The universe is very complex. Therefore, it must have been created by a mind, right? One could argue that that's begging the question, that that conclusion, the mind part, is even more controversial, because wouldn't you need an even more complex mind, and where would that come from, right? Are we arguing for one thing with something that's even less admitted? Begging the question, we have the case where a premise, right, one of the early parts of the argument, the premise, either actually needs the conclusion for its own justification, or it's simply a disguised version of the conclusion itself. So that's where you're actually sneaking the conclusion into the premises of the argument. This would be like arguing in a circle, right? For example, the Bible is the Word of God. We know this to be true because the Bible itself teaches this truth, and the teachings of the Bible are trustworthy precisely because its revelations are divinely inspired. Right? Now, in that argument, if you look at it carefully, if you've got the page in front of you, the conclusion is actually the first thing stated. The Bible is the Word of God. But one of the premises is the very last thing stated. Its revelations are divinely inspired, which is the same thing as saying the Bible is the Word of God. So this is begging the question. The conclusion is actually snuck into the premises. This would be interesting to discuss, well, how do we know that the Bible is the Word of God then? Suppressed evidence. Remember we talked about the necessity of having all the information, right, in an inductive argument, that principle of total evidence requirement. This would be where we simply drop some of that necessary information. Some important piece of evidence is ignored, which would undermine the given argument for the conclusion. For example, Adolf Hitler reversed the hyperinflation of the German mark, practically eliminated unemployment, restored German industry, raised the living standard of the ordinary German citizen substantially, and restored the pride of a demoralized nation. It follows that he was a great and beneficial leader of the German nation. Clearly left out some pretty relevant information. And finally, for now, composition. The conclusion of an argument depends on the erroneous transfer of an attribute of the part of something onto the whole, right? So a really clear example of composition is when we attribute something, when something is attributable to the part, and therefore we attribute it to the whole. So every brick in the wall is 2 pounds. Therefore, the whole wall is 2 pounds. Clearly false. That's a fallacy of composition. How about this? Every moment of time begins and ends. Therefore, time itself began and will end. That's a fallacy. Whether or not that's true, that's a fallacy of composition. Then we can talk about fallacies in critiques of inductive arguments. This has got to be the most common logical fallacy right now. Arguments against the person, that is ad hominem. Rather than attack the belief or the rationale behind a belief directly, a critic attacks the person holding the belief. Miss Orfield is a lobbyist for GE. Therefore, her arguments in favor of the reduction of corporate taxes ought to be disregarded. Right? We're not going to talk about the corporate tax. We're going to talk about Mrs. Orfield. Or Nate argues that environmental concerns are a genuine ethical issue. But Nate, as we all know, is a silly person. Therefore, environmental concerns are not a genuine ethical issue. Attack the person. This happens all the time, right? Anytime you hear an argument where a person is called a name, right, and their argument dismissed, right? Very common today. A person is a bigot. Boom, done. Argument done. That would be an example, right? As opposed to addressing the argument itself. Another argument I don't have up here, another fallacy I don't have up here that's somewhat related is, we should talk about this one in class too, is the genetic fallacy. Think of the term genetic, right, where our makeup comes from, or Genesis, the book of Genesis, where everything came from. The genetic fallacy argues against something based on its source, right, where it came from. Rather than addressing the actual argument, what's attacked is how it originated. And you'll see this again in discussions of religion. You only believe that because, right? You only believe that because you were born in America. If you were born in Iraq, you'd be Muslim. You only believe that because you were born in a Baptist house. If you were born in a Catholic house, you'd be Catholic. Has nothing to do with the actual truth claims of the religion, but is attacking the genesis of those beliefs. We can talk more about that one too. And straw man. This is where one mischaracterizes a position held by someone to make it more vulnerable, and then attacks that mischaracterized position. So you give your interlocutor, your debate partner, you give their argument the lowest possible presentation, and then attack that. So, for example, Father Klein maintains that in certain circumstances it's morally permissible to lie. But this just amounts to the unqualified adoption of the principle that the end justifies the means. But if one adopts such a principle, one can conceivably condone absolutely any action, for example, the torture of children, if it were required to achieve a sufficiently great social utility. So, and if you followed all that, but the idea is this gives a very, dumbed down position or explanation of what Father Klein might have actually been trying to get at. So one thing we'll do in class is look at other examples of these logical fallacies. Another video I pulled from YouTube that you'll be watching is, I think, something like 31 logical fallacies in 8 minutes, because they're so abundant. So one of the things we want to do looking at any argument is try to pick out fallacies, and in our own thinking is to eliminate fallacies.